Let's look at another academic pursuit, and we do that with a great honor today of having Alvin Roth on our set. Game theory, well, there is little more complex and subtle and more controversial than the study of what we do in our daily game playing. For most of us, well, it's a cursory knowledge of something like prisoner's dilemma. Remember, you took that in school and forgot it 2 days later. Maybe we know something about Nash equilibrium, named after John Nash of Princeton, of course, a professor, and his wife tragically killed last week in New Jersey in a horrific car accident. All of economics mourns. The reality is game theory is a land of mathematics and serious analysis of set theory. It's a land of Alvin and Shapley mechanisms, and I mentioned Frank Ramsey earlier, second best Ramsey price schemes. Our guest is a laureate, Alvin Roth. He's not a macroeconomist. He's a mathematician looking at set theory and the things that, say, someone like Mohamed El-Erian talks about every day. If you were to explain not the undergraduate prisoner's dilemma course, but when you get to graduate school, what's your single emphasis of game theory to people striving to be smarter at it?
I think it's to think how information moves around in markets, what signals you send, not just what you do, but what people infer about what you want and what you might do in the future. One
of the great theories here, and this comes out of George Soros and I think of Karl Popper at LSE 50 and 60 years ago, is there's stuff that we can observe, but there's so much that we can't observe. There's a set of information that we don't know that's out there. How humble should we be about what we don't know?
We have to be very humble about what we don't know. And
we learn it the hard way every 6 or 7 years, don't we?
Well, one of the differences between markets and central planning is that markets allow people to aggregate their information and figure out what should happen instead of having a planner who doesn't have the necessary information try to figure out who should get what.
Brendan, one of the great practices of this, and you mentioned this earlier, is Mohamed El-Erian. Here's a quote from Dr. El-Erian, the basics of game theory. In a cooperative game, players coordinate to achieve better outcomes than the ones that would prevail in the absence of coordination. If the game is played uncooperatively, everybody's miserable. That's my own words there. Dr. El-Erian talking on the late John Nash.
Well, I had no idea what you were talking about earlier. I brought up cooperative games, and you said, is this your El-Erian moment? And I said, I didn't even know I was capable of having an El-Erian moment.
But this is serious. Mohammed is from the United Kingdom schools, and this is a cottage industry over in England versus what it is in America.
And I would argue, we were talking about this earlier, that one of the things that we're seeing in Greece is we're watching a cooperative game with rules. There was an agreement. They agreed to it. Turning into a non-cooperative game, Greece is using a different strategy. I wanted to ask about something slightly different, which is in your book, Dr. Roth, you talk about regulation. Of course, regulation has to adapt with markets, but at its best, it's a defensive regulation that you write, which is that it's a way of designing rules for markets. Do we talk about the word regulation in the right way here in the U.S.?
Well, markets operate according to rules, and the rules can be provided by governments or by private providers. The New York Stock Exchange has lots of rules, some of which are provided by the exchange and some of which are laws. And markets to work freely need good rules, rules that allow them to work freely. Regulations can be a part of that.
Regulations can be good rules. Tony Dwyer of Canaccord Genuity wants to jump in here.
We were talking a little bit earlier. There's always a derivative effect of regulation that you don't see. For example, after the 1987 crash, they created the small order execution system, which guaranteed that if you were making a market and were high bid or low offer, you had to be good on 1,000 shares. That created what was called the SOS bandits. And that was the first software program that I can find where it was designed to pick off that trader that was guaranteeing 1,000 shares. So that regulation fast-forwarded today to high-frequency trading and no market liquidity. So I think we have to be careful about the rules and the regulation, what the derivative impacts can be.
If we talk about regulation, the rules of the game in this world, they are a consequence of the raft of legislation that was passed after the financial crash. Very complex regulations, very finely tuned. Do successful markets work with simple rules instead of large, complex sets of rules?
We go back to Occam's razor. Is simple better, Professor?
Rules need to adapt to changing environments, and simple rules are good when you can manage with them, but markets can suffer from too much or too little regulation. They can suffer from regulations being instituted too slowly or being abandoned too slowly.
Let me ask you your to-do list for 2015. Can you get Dodd-Frank down to 42 pages? That would be a good thing.
Not even you can do that.
Not even Professor Roth can do that. Alvin
Tom,
Roth,
but
thank
this
you.
is like a super important point, because let's look at the Volcker rule. That regulation comes out of pain. You never change things when things are good. So you take a worst-case scenario and you create a normal-case scenario off of that. And the problem with that is there's no liquidity in the bond market, so all of a sudden energy becomes 18% of the high-yield market. There's no other side of the trade.
Oh, there you go, getting gloomy again.
No, it's just...
But the Volcker rule ended up being a rule of incredible complexity.